Hi, it's Dr. McNeil here. Happy New Year. This is the first time I've managed to do it, even though it's the 22nd of January of 2026. This is the first time I've managed to do any video this year. That's because my second book, which is called Dominion Theology, recovering our social and political responsibility, has just gone to the proofing stage. So it means I've done the manuscript, it goes to the publisher, they proof it, and it then goes back and forward a bit, asking you to do changes and tidy stuff up. But that gives me just a slight window to do some stuff, and as my wife's in Japan as well, it just gives me just like a little bit of time where I can sit in front of a camera and talk. Because there's been some stuff that's been, I think, bubbling around in maybe for months, and I just haven't had the opportunity really to sit down and give any time to it. So I'm probably going to be a little bit wide-ranging in what I'll talk about, just because there's some stuff, I think some political stuff that needs some sort of comment, and I might end up chopping it up into shorter parts, of the same shoot or whatever, or try and get some YouTube shorts in there, because I heard some of the stuff I'll just be talking about. I heard it spoken, heard somebody sort of share something, and I thought that's just a couple of sentences that encapsulates part of the problem. So so it's a little bit, I suppose in some senses you could say it's a little bit controversial, because I want to start talking about Islam. And the reason why I want to say something about Islam is, obviously we've just had the months and months and months since what happened in Israel, and it's about 2.5, maybe between 1,500 and 2,000 people that were just killed at the one music festival, and obviously other Israeli citizens who were killed, and war was used, and rape was used as a weapon of war, and it was the most brutal it could possibly be, because that was the aim of Hamas, was to try and provoke Israel into hitting back very, very hard, and they would then have the propaganda coup, and the world would turn against Israel. And in many ways, they've probably won that part of they've certainly won part of that propaganda war, haven't they? Because with the people coming out on the streets at the different, especially in Europe and the different European cities and London, you couldn't go out as a Jewish person. You would be attacked, and the police would not defend you when you are out, and they would defend the right of people to sort of like to march and stuff there. But if you were there as an observer, they showed some clips of Jewish observers, and the police would not protect them. They could be harassed and spat on, and there are shops attacked and synagogues attacked, and we've just had another incident here in the UK where I think our second city is called Birmingham, and the West Midlands, it's in the Midlands, it's what's called the Midlands. The UK's got different sort of like areas, and the Midlands, as you would imagine, is sort of like the middle of the country, or middle of England. And Birmingham's our second city after London. It's an enormous city, and if you've ever driven through it, it's got an amazing past as a place, very famous there. When you used to drive into Birmingham, you used to see this big enormous building called the Fort Dunlop, which is Dunlop Tires, where they used to make Dunlop tires, and they've got like multi-tiered motorways as you go through Birmingham. It was very, very famous for the motor industry, and the motor sort of that culture. Then you got one of these crazy lefty councils that sort of like came in and said, we're going to go green and we're going to change the culture of the whole thing. Just to make mess of stuff, and the city went bankrupt a few years ago, but one thing it's very much known for. I mean, that's a lesson in itself. You get a bunch of lefties running your council, and it goes broke. And that's been repeated time and time again. That happened in London during the late 1980s, when there was lots of radical left sort of councils in charge of different councils in London, and the councils basically became totally dysfunctional. And there was this case where this guy, he was a basically homeless guy, but he somehow managed to get in to squat in one of these council sort of like houses in London, and he was there unchallenged for over 10 years. And there's a law in the UK that if you're in a property, I think, for more than 10 years, you've got a claim on the title of the property. So he went, and so you get this incompetence, and you're seeing this. I think you're seeing this in the US when you get when you get socialists, or you get people who progressives, you'd call them in the UK, but in the US, wouldn't you? But they're now just self-identifying now as socialists. But when you get people like that who are controlling vast quantities of money, two things happen. One, you get this enormous incompetence. How you can get enormous corruption. Which again you're seeing in the US with what's going on in Minnesota. Yeah, and so it's the reason why I want to say something about Islam is because in the back of all this stuff, there's this profile. Islam's been there, and that's been obvious with the Hamas and the Palestinians, or the demonstrations, because people are marching under the flags of Hamas and Hezbollah, and which are radical Islamic organizations. And you've then got what seems like a little bit of a paradox is that you've got people who would call themselves socialists, or people who identify as Marxists and communists, who are marching with the Muslims. And you would think, well, how could that possibly be? Because the radical left is it's historically been atheistic, and all religions considered as a mental illness. If there was, I think it was one of the we've got the radical left. We've got a left-wing socialist party called the Labour Party. In some senses, all our main parties are like socialists. They're just more diluted forms of socialism. Even our Conservative Party, what's called the Conservative Party, is still a socialist party. It still believes in big government. That's what defines socialism. Socialism believes that the instruments of government are there to ensure that in the sense to ensure that just societies, all the instruments of the state are used to impose, if you like, on a quality of outcome rather than equality of opportunity on the people. So the state becomes all powerful and all encompassing in a socialist country. So for us we've seen that for us in the UK. So we've just got that sort of spectrum. But on our left, which you would call the Marxist left, the radical left, our main left-wing party, the left wing of that now, the whole party, like I think you'd see this, we'll see what's gone on with the Democrats in the US as well. You've seen this major leftward shift, and people are sort of openly radical. And our Prime Minister at the moment, is a radical left commie. Not to put too fine a point on it. They really are. He was one of the strongest supporters of the previous leader of the party, of the Labour Party, who was he was now kicked out of the party in like a left-wing coup. If you know anything about left-wing politics, radical left politics, they're always conniving and cooing against one another. And we had somebody who was the head of the party called Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party, and he led the party for quite a few years. And then there was some sort of contrived, basically coup, talking about, because the left has always, he was accused of not dealing with the anti-Semitism problem within the Labour Party. But the Labour Party's always been anti-Semitic. Radical left parties and radical right parties have always been anti-Semitic. The Jews, there's always a Jew to blame somewhere. It's one of the things, I think some people call it the horseshoe theory of politics. The radical left and the radical right basically end up meeting with one another, don't they? Because they both reject democracy. They both reject, and they've got a certain common things that they reject. They become fascists, So you get left-wing fascists and right-wing fascists. People that don't accept the norms of democratic or Western society. And I think that's the key, really, when you want to talk about Islam. That's my interest in it, because everybody. Let me make this clear, sort of from the top, is that everybody has a basic right to worship God as they please and worship the God who they please. That's just the one of the privileges of being human. But what made the West is the West. When people say Western values, it's interesting to understand what that actually means, because Western values are derived from Christian values. They're derived from a certain understanding of the world, and Islamic values, and what Islam stands for, is not compatible with these Western values, and so that's why, if you want to understand why, if you like, the communists are marching with, and the radical socialists, the progressives, are marching with radical Islamists and Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood and these. If you want to understand how these two groups that would on the surface seem to have completely different and opposing views would be prepared to support one another, and you get the living, breathing contradiction in some ways with Mamdani, who's been elected mayor of New York, in the most famous, well, probably, if not the probably one of, in the top 3 most famous cities in the world, and most important cities as a financial center in the world. When people think about New York, they think about America. They think, New York symbolizes America in many ways. And so you've got this living, breathing contradiction. Here you are. If you've got somebody who self-identifies as Muslim and self-identifies as, calls himself a democratic socialist, but he's not really democratic socialist. I think you can almost drop the democratic. He's a Marxist. He's somebody that believes in the Communist Manifesto of seizing the means of production. You can go back a few years and you can see him talking about seizing the means of production, which is what communists do. You state-run everything. The state gets bigger and bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger and stronger in communist societies. And when there's a communist revolution, the state controls everything. Micromanages everything. If you saw his speech that he was, I don't think it was his acceptance speech, but I think it was his first speech of the new year, where he was talking to his supporters, and because his acceptance speech, if you like, the mask came off. If you did watch that acceptance speech, that speech wasn't particularly well received, even by those who'd pushed him in the mainstream media. I think they saw somebody who was very different, very angry, very aggressive, saying, "We're coming after you, and we're coming after you. We're going to tax you," and that's what socialists are like. Unfortunately, I think it was Mrs. Thatcher that made the comment that eventually socialists run out of other people's money. and that is what's going to happen. There's only ever, if and I grew up during the a time in the UK during the late 70s. From the mid sort of like 70s onwards. I mean, the UK was in a mess during the 1970s, because in the sense that it lost its place in the world as an imperial power just after the Second World War. It lost most of its empire, because most of them got most of its colonies got independence, and there was all sorts of independence movements, and really the economy, really, in the backing of the strength of the British economy, it just went it just collapsed, because we'd embraced socialism after the Second World War. We had our the major social and cultural change with our first parliament. We have like 4 or 5 years sort of like parliament, and the first one after the war was a radical socialist one. I think maybe they lost the election after that, but then they came back again on the next election. And then we had you had this basically this enormous, this sort of Keynesian, if you know anything about Keynesian economics, just spend loads of money, generate loads of debt, and then you inflate your debt away. And that was up until maybe 5-10 years ago. That was the economic norm of nations. That's why inflation has been something that's been constant, because people just think they can spend a lot, print a load of money, they spend a lot, build all this stuff, and then they try and inflate the debt away. And that's the bottom sort of like fell out of that in about 10-15 years ago. But it's like the whole when you have this meshing of radical Islam and the Marxist left, you think, well, how's that possible? Because you on the surface, you've got people that that are pushing like a theocratic model, and then you've got this atheistic model. How can they possibly gel or join in any way? And the reason why they can gel and join in any way in the West anyway, okay, this is very much a Western phenomena, because this is not how, say, radical Islam works in the Middle East or works in Malaysia, Indonesia, or in other countries of the world where Islam is strong. This is something that's very, very particular to the Western world. There is an interesting historical study that you can do when you go back to the Russian Revolution, and in one of Lenin's earliest conference, one of the earliest communist conferences, Lenin actually made the case, and because there was representatives from, interestingly, from Islamic fighters who wanted to have, who wanted to create like an Islamic state. They wanted to get rid of these oppressive rulers that were dominating them, and they wanted to create like some sort of Islamic state. And Lenin made the case that this is like a localization. These struggles that these people are going through, these workers are going through, these can be considered as a localized struggle for a class struggle in those cultures. So there has been this union between what people are calling the red of the Marxists and the green of Islam. And the key word is revolutionaries, because both these groups are revolutionaries. They have got no interest in reforming the society, but basically keeping it the same, if you like. They want to completely destroy it and rebuild a new society. That's what a revolutionary is. A revolution is not really a reformer, other than in the sense a revolutionary is going to destroy everything. That's why it's revolution. It's not evolution in a sense. People might say be some sort of, maybe they're political reformers in the sense they want to change what they basically perceive as something wrong in society. You'd say that person's a reformer, but a revolutionary is not really a reformer. You have to understand that if you want to use the word properly, a revolutionary is somebody that's going to tear everything down and then replace it with that which is supposed to be better. And that's why you have this union between Marxists and radical Islamists. So I hope that's sort of like just a little bit of the feel of why those two groups that would seemingly be from the point of view of the details of what they actually believe would in many ways in opposition to one another. It's a bit like the paradox of, you had Queers for Palestine, wasn't it? I don't know if you've seen that group, you heard about this group, Queers for Palestine. And the obvious question is, the obvious statement you want to say to somebody is, well, don't try and be a queer in Palestine, because if you were openly, if you tried to have a gay pride parade in Gaza City, they'd take you up to the top of the building, they'd throw you off and kill you, or they'd stone you to death there on the spot. So there's seemingly this enormous paradox between people who their ideologies are incompatible with one another, other than the fact that they are revolutionaries And that's why you see the radical Marxists prepared to support Hamas, and assist in every way that they possibly can, and agitate and cause disruption, because the most valuable thing to a Marxist, and you're seeing this in the Minnesota and in the struggle with ICE and the COLA. ICE is a federal government organization whose task it is to go around, and it is to find those people who are legally in the US. They've been through the point. The point with ICE is this is what people don't understand. They say, no, they're just grabbing US citizens off the street and deport and do it's like as if they're arbitrarily just grabbing anybody and like this paramilitary force that's grabbing US citizens off the street, and that's not what ICE is. ICE is an organization that is tasked by an act of Congress with a specific task, which is, these people that ICE are going after are people who've been through, had their due process through the immigration, whether it's been they've sort of tried to claim asylum, or they were let into the interior of the country, but a judge has sat, and normally they would have like a deportation order already. They've already been through due process. They just haven't left the country. And so ICE is tasked with finding these people and deporting them. That's their role. And the vast majority of these people that ICE are going after, I think it's astonishing. I think it's something like 75% or something. They are people who've already, they've already committed other serious crimes on top of the fact that they're in the country illegal. So, it's such a it's not for the Marxists who are behind the creating like this narrative, which basically they're now pushing, and you can read, if you want to do the research, you can read it now on some of the bulletin boards, and they're calling for people to be militant, because some of the leaders have been very smart with this organization in Minnesota, is that they've been training people as to what they can do, what they can and they can't do. So they've been very, very smart in the sense of using the rights that they have under the US Constitution to people are supposed to be able to sort of like observe, they can say they're observers and they come, but they've not been, so there's some very smart sort of like legal people who've been trying to say this, you can get to this point, you're not allowed to not do this, but then you got to the point where, where people were, with what happened with Renee Goode, and, basically, it ended up, ignoring the instructions from the federal officer to stop and to and to get out of the vehicle. And if anybody should be prosecuted under that circumstance, it's not the officer that shot Renee Goode. It should really be her so-called wife, because she was the one. You can listen to the videos, and she's the one that say, right, let's get out of here. So and there's a whole, there's lots of different angles of those videos. So you have to see the one from the officer who shot Renee. You have to see the one from his cam, and you have to see the one from behind the vehicle, and then you can see the wheels turning, and you can see that he doesn't pull his gun until she turns the wheel back to drive off, and he's think, I'm going to get run over here, because that guy had already been 6 months earlier, he'd been trying to get somebody else, and then he'd been dragged down the road. So there's all sorts of arguments, but the basic facts are clear. And I mean, that's something in itself, to see how people can look at the same videos and come up with completely different narratives surrounding it. But the main point for a Marxist is that it's not sort of like the details of what's going on there. It's the fact that you can cause disruption and disturbance, and you're pushing forward your overall aim of trying to make an area ungovernable. And what's happened in the sense with Minnesota as well is that we see this in the UK as well, in certain parts of the UK, in fact in the area that I live in, which is the northeast of England, and it happened in some parts of London as well, is that when you've basically got like a one-party state, that's for want of a better term, where because of the culture here in this area, this used to be like a big industrial area. So it's been a very working class area, and there was heavy industry here, and so and socialists, I think in the US, it's like when you get heavy industrial areas, don't you? Like I think like Baltimore and it's where and Pennsylvania, and I think like that when you get like that, people were often, you know, a lot of the big unions, they were Democrats or something. You know, there was like historically that's been the case. And in the UK, historically, where you've had old cities, it's completely different now because lots of the heavy industries got decimated during the, you know, as a deliberate government policy during the 80s and 90s, and we started, you know, globalization. We started buying ships from, you know, we'd rather buy a ship from cheaper somewhere else, and you know all the outsourcing that went on, and it decimated our heavy industry, because people said, oh, service industries are just going to replace you know, normal industry, you know, rather than manufacturing. So our base was absolutely decimated, and so these big cities have always historically been dominated by Labour politics, and in the northeast of England where I am, that's even more so. You know, it's been like a one-party state, and to be honest, whenever you get a one-party state, whether it's, if you like, more conservative or as we are here, it's like left, you always get corruption, because this happened in the during the, you know, the 90s in some of the London councils, which were either the ones that were one-party state Labour, left-wing, and one-party state, if you like, conservative. So, you know, they'd been, you know, the wealthy, if you like, wealthy areas. So they both had the same problems in the sense of corruption, because nobody, and this is what you're seeing in Minnesota, I think, when you know, as somebody that's on the outside, I haven't got any, you know, I'm not an American, so I'm not, but I'm just making that sort of like comment because it's been dominated. You're definitely seeing it in California. When you've had this one-party rule, you get this enormous amount of corruption and fraud, and you get people into positions of power. Like it's astonishing. I think the Attorney General, the chief law officer of Minnesota, you know, you know, he's on tape, sort of like telling, saying to people, "Oh, don't worry about these things. We'll find a way of." You know, I'll find a way of protecting you from fraud investigation. All it needs is a letter from me, and most people will back off. You know, people like that are so obviously blatantly corrupt, and you think, how can that happen? It's a bit like we're in California with the they're supposed to have like an independent voting board, weren't they? That about zoning, because Trump basically said, give me 5 or 6 seats in Texas, because the demographic change in Texas. And I mean, that's the bizarre thing, is that the ones in Texas, they'd created like Hispanic sort of constituencies and stuff, and so it wasn't that it was racist in some way. It's just because there'd been change, and he said with this sort of rezoning, it's questionable whether or not in the middle, like people were saying, should he have done it in the middle of like an election cycle? But there'd been so much gerrymandering going on elsewhere, in democratic, in blue states, that in a sense Trump's just said, okay, fair enough, you want to play like this, Texas, give me, so, and then California, as a direct reaction to that, not in the sense that it was something that they were going to were going to do. I think that's the difference between what went on in Texas and what went on in California, is that this was already, in a sense, something that Texas was going to do, recognizing its own demographic change, whereas in California, the boundaries were supposed to be determined by this independent commission, but the head of the independent commission just said, it's okay, we don't mind, just go and do this, we'll just stick it on the ballot, we'll make sure it gets passed. So the whole process is totally corrupt. When you get like the one-party state, when nobody gets challenged, you get these, the corruption gets embedded, and I don't think you can see that any more clearly than what's gone on in Minnesota with the Somali community. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic there, because I've listened to quite a few you can hear sort of like experts on Somali culture, like Somalis themselves, professors or people that when they talk about the Somali community, and I think what's her name? She's an amazing sort of academic, Ellie, who she escaped. She was, she suffered as a woman, female genital mutilation when she was a child, and then she's escaped to the West. I think she's married to an English guy, an Oxford guy now. I'll find her word, but she's amazing to speak. She's a Somali, and when she speaks, she's so articulate about Islam itself, which I will get to. she's amazing when she talks about Islam, because for a time she was very much associated with the Christopher Hitchens and the Four Horsemen and the Apocalypse and Richard Dawkins and stuff. I think she was an atheist for this period, very radical sort of critic of religion, and then somehow she was drawn into Christianity. I think it was through one of her friends or something had something remarkable had happened. But she's an amazingly articulate person when she talks about Islam and when she talks about Somali culture, and it's just built in. I mean, this is what is so foreign to us, because we tend to think that other people think like we do, that people from other parts of the world actually think like we do, and have the same values as we do. We tend to look at things through a Western lens, and we interpret what they say through a Western lens. So, with our values. So, what are Western values? This is what people, somebody said to me, well, what are British values? I can remember somebody challenging me once, said, well, what are British values? They were a person of colour, and they were somebody that had been brought up in this country, but they didn't think there was any such thing as British values. But there are Western values. One of the Western values is, this is the thing. One of the great things about the American Constitution is that it makes explicit a lot of stuff that comes from what's called the English common law. And the English common law emerged in the period, say, 1200. I think our Magna Carta, which was the first document which tried to articulate the natural rights that somebody has before God, natural rights as a citizen. Now, in the US, this is blatant and obvious, because it's part of the American culture of, the founders of the US believed that our rights come from God. It's explicit, isn't it? I think it's in the preamble of the Constitution where it talks about our rights coming from God. Because if your rights come from God, then nobody can take your rights away. If all you've got is the government, in the socialist worldview and in the communist worldview, the government, if your rights come from the government, then the government giveth and the government take away. So the Magna Carta was the first sort of like document that challenged what was called the divine right of kings to rule, because you can use certain scriptures in the New Testament and you can say, right, a king has a king's been ordained by God to rule, and therefore if you like, the whatever the king says, it happens. Whereas the Magna Carta was the first that tried to broaden out what were the rights of the citizen, and it to rein in the power of the king. And so, and eventually with the Protestant Reformation, that became the power. The power was it was much broader, and you have the idea of democracy and of business and the different domains of culture, which is something what my book's about. So which I am going to do a series just on the book. So, but you have to sort of like to understand that these are Western values. So the idea of, say, free speech, that is a Western value. That came from the English common law, that somebody could not be compelled to speak in a particular way, that they're allowed to hold an opinion themselves, and to have their own view. and to argue that view and to stay in that view without the danger of state sanction, of just because you're going to say something. Now, it may be, I mean, when you consider free speech more broadly, your speech can be protected, but that doesn't mean that you're if you're starting to try and by your speech inciting violence against a particular group of people, or if you're expressing extremely severe views, then it may be that you've got a right to say those things, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be consequences for what you say. But the idea of, so that's the more of a general argument about, what are the limits of free speech in there. But the concept of free speech, that you are able to hold and to say what you like and to hold the views that you like without being labelled a heretic, or without, that's something that's a Western value. And democracy is a Western value, the idea that the legitimacy of a government comes from the people who are ruled. It's like it's a social contract where, you're believing that your government and your politicians are working in your interest, and therefore you're prepared to send them as your representative, and that you're prepared to be ruled by them. You're entering into some sort of social contract with them. That's like a very, very Western concept. And so I think, one of the points I really, if I'm going to narrow this down a bit, I'll probably have a little bit of a break so I can get a drink. But so really what I want to talk about because if you don't understand that, say that when we're sort of like looking at what's going on in other parts of the world, and there's two, I mean, I had this, I mean, it's interesting. I went to the barbers this morning. I was talking to and my barbers, like the one of the barbers I go to, we've got quite a few Iranian sort of like barbers in this area for whatever reason. There's quite an Iranian community in the west part of our city. There's quite a big long established sort of like Asian community, but there's also lots of like Persians and sort of like Iranians who are there. And so I was very interested to find out what his take would be on are you supporting what's going on in Iran? And he had a totally completely different view of what was going on in Iran, even though he was living here. He was very much say that this is Iran's business, it's not anybody else's business. So it's like he was saying whatever goes on there, and it was really interesting. But his perspective, the point I'm making is his perspective as somebody from another part, from a non-Western perspective, his view of what's going on in Iran is totally different than, say, what our view is, and so which is and that's what I want to sort of like to say. That how I want to bring that out is that when you have say like in Minnesota, where you've got like a Somali community there, I was getting to that point where I was saying that experts on Somali culture will tell you that it's par for the course in their culture that they believe that defrauding your government is fine. It's just expected. It's expected that that by whatever means necessary, you can, if you can get away with it, defrauding your government, that's okay. That's part of their culture. And and really, you should see with the mess that is Somalia, you should understand, corruption, and if you like, lawlessness, and this sort of like that is part of their value set. And so, when you try and look at it from the point of view of being Western, to say how could these people possibly do this? How could there be so much obvious corruption there? Because we had Nick Shirley, didn't we? Who went around and basically exposed all this massive. I think it's now estimated at something like 20 billion has been taken from the defrauded from different public programs within Minnesota, unless I'm getting confused with the Californian one there. But I know it's at least 8, and even 8 is astonishing, isn't it? Estimating sort of like, of this is, if you like, American citizen taxpayer money that's been supposed to be put into these programs, that's been pulled off by fake businesses and fake childcare centres and fake health centres, fake feeding programs, all this stuff, and money has just flowed. And so, and you think, how could that possibly happen? And then you've got this, these incredibly influential members of the Somali community. I know there's been like 60 or 70 indictments and of people now, but you've got incredibly influential, isn't it? Like Ilhan Omar, who's the Somali representative there, and they've gone up from something like, they've amassed this enormous amount of wealth in the last 2 years or something. And do you really think, it's all alleged at the moment, it's all this alleged data, nobody's proved anything at the moment, but the circumstantial evidence is almost overwhelming, isn't it? That she knew, some influential people that have been now convicted of fraud, and well, then you think, where have they managed to amass this £30 million a fortune from in 2 years? And so but you don't understand unless you actually understand, right? This people group has a value set that is completely un-Western. And so if you think that they're going to respect free speech, or that they're going to respect property, or if they're going to expect your property as a government, their mission is to rip off the government, and it's perfectly okay to rip off the government in some cultures. That's how you get ahead in life, is ripping off the government. And so this is something we need to understand as what it means to be somebody that's in the West. We tend to sort of give privileges, if you like, and intellectual privileges when we I think it's called I think there's a book coming out by the social psychologist Gad Saad, who's I think he's originally from Lebanon, grew up in Lebanon, I think, until he was 11 or 12, and then I think he had to flee Lebanon when the Lebanese civil war broke out. He was part of the Jewish community in Lebanon. Lebanon used to be, the country used to be, it used to be known as as the Paris of the Middle East. It used to be it was I think it was something like 80-something% Christian at one point, but I think the Christian community is now down to maybe 10-12%, and the Jewish community is obviously being decimated, and most of the Jews have left, and it's now predominantly, I think, 80-something% Muslim. But it's like the culture that really the concept. Gad Saad's, I think he's just his book's just about to come out. He's a social psychologist, he's a professor, very senior sort of guy, very accomplished guy. But he calls it suicidal empathy, where we as Westerners don't understand that these enormous immigrant communities that are coming into our country, that we've massive, people from predominantly Muslim backgrounds, have completely different value sets, and that if you suddenly move this enormous community into a place, then all the if you like, the problems and the values of that community come with them. People aren't integrating this idea of being a big melting pot now. That's considered imperialistic and racist. It's more like a salad bowl thing where people are supposed to complement one another. I watched this series with my wife. It was called the something like the Tokyo salad bowl, and the underlying if you like, the underlying message, if you like, this wasn't even, it was looking at the experience of foreigners in Japanese society, because Japanese society is still very much still very Japanese, and a lot of the foreigner groups and the if you like, the underclass, the Korean underclass, or that they can be treated very poorly within Japanese society. And it was trying to bring out people that were coming from the Philippines, because the politicians have been importing in these people as an underclass to do menial tasks and as cheap labour. And this was sort of like trying to look at this, the terrible abuse and the experience of these foreigners within Japanese culture. And so, but they were really the real point that Gad's trying to make. He calls it suicidal empathy, where you're opening up your society and culture and thinking that all these massive groups of people that are coming for whatever reason, and this is the thing, is these aren't people that, in a sense, that are seeking asylum, if you like, or they've abused the asylum system, because asylum was supposed to be for, if there was like a major war, it's a bit like when we had a massive Syrian exodus into Europe. You could arguably say that yes, there was, even though there was 2 million people, I think, left Syria or something. I think maybe it was something upwards of 6 million, but 2 million ended up coming into the EU. And you've got an argument to say, right, these people were fleeing war and persecution, and you've got an argument to say that's what asylum is supposed to be for. And asylum is distinct from somebody who's an economic migrant, and an economic migrant is just somebody that's looking and seeking a better life. Now, there's been a deliberate attempt within, say, the left to conflate those two categories together, or to say that those two aren't categories, that all, and that in fact the very concept of a national border is racist, and that people should be allowed to go wherever they want. And in fact, this iteration of European history, or the history of the West, are where you're suddenly getting these enormous movements of population from parts of the world. This is just, if you like, this is the rebalancing of the scales of, the West that's plundered the rest of the planet. Now it's going to be plundered, and they don't view this revolutionary idea. They don't view anything about the West as worth saving. So that's the stakes for us as Westerners. The idea of free speech. Free speech is a Western value. Democracy is a Western value. And the reason why I want to focus so much on Islam is because I think there may be 51, 53 Islamic nations, I think, and I don't think there may be one or two of those where I don't think any of them are actually democracies. I think maybe one or two of them are more pluralistic, in the sense they allow people a certain degree of freedom. I think it's like in Bahrain or the United Arab Emirates. They're more pluralistic in the sense they do allow. I think they might allow there to be people to hold non-Islamic views and not be killed. that's something we need. When I talk about Islam in proper, to actually understand what actually goes on in an Islamic nation within their culture, and what views you're allowed to hold, because the word Islam means submit. So it's not like you can just hold any views you can. If you make public views that are un-Islamic in an Islamic nation, you're likely to be abducted, and in the more radical ones, you're likely to be killed, or you're likely to be imprisoned or killed, or killed, or subject to some sort of public display. If after you've had your disciplining, which basically means torturing, if you're prepared to get up in front of a crowd, and sometimes it's theatrical. Sometimes women are humiliated in the most grievous ways in some of these countries. I remember watching I think it was in Indonesia, somewhere in Indonesia, but it was like it was a bit like when people go out to watch, say, like a football match here. People were going out with their families and stuff, and then they brought out this woman who'd been caught in adultery or something. And it's always the woman there, it's not the guy, it's always the woman, But it was just like basically a show, and you had this sort of like theatre where, where the, I don't know, the Islamic judge or something came out in all his gear and sort of, and had this, and then she was supposed to publicly repent, and then I don't know, he whipped her or something, for her to do a, and you just think, that sort of like, when you understand that people's values are that different from your own, you can't then say, right, when you're giving, if you're going to march with Hamas in London, through London, or you're going to allow your community, if you like, your Muslim communities that are there embracing this value set, you need to understand that value set is totally 100%. Its aim is to completely destroy everything about what makes your country as a Western country, that you can have free speech, that you can have freedom of religion, that men and women basically have equal rights, equal role within the workplace, and that women aren't just slaves to produce children and to look after the men. You know, you go out in some if you ever go on holiday to an Islamic nation, if you go out in the evening, you only see men out because women aren't allowed to be outside. That's not every, but unless they're European, white European, or they're there on holiday. But the actual women themselves, it's really weird, because you see these programs with these guys, they go, it's really strange, we're sort of like going out filming, and all we see is men. Yes, because women aren't allowed to be out. So these sort of values, this understanding what is valuable to us as Westerners, and actually understanding the difference between cultures which are influenced by the West and basically have, if you like, a Western value. So not all, it's like, countries like, say, for example, like Japan, they've been influenced by the West because of, because America, basically defeated Japan, didn't it, and dropped on, and so in many ways Japan has modelled itself in some ways after the, it's weird driving around Japan and seeing drugstore. That's American English for what we'd call a chemist or a pharmacist here, so you can see the influences of American culture, American music and fashion and stuff, when we say Western, we mean, it's like Australia fundamentally has Western values, because it, even though there was beginnings as a penal colony, a lot of the migration when Australia, a lot of the migration was initially European migration, and so they have a Western mindset to it. But what's been happening within the West in the last a couple of decades, and what's become very, very focused in I would say for me in the last, paying attention to it closely in the last 5 or 6 years, is this attempt to sort of like Islamicize our society and to make Islam somehow compatible with the West, and to somehow to say and come up with this strange thing called Islamophobia, which is something that's completely made up, because all Islamophobia means is that you are the way it's being used in our culture is that you cannot criticize Islam. That's what Islamophobia means. It means you can't, if you're going to say highlight the fact of say female genital mutilation and say this is unacceptable, you would be called Islamophobic, because that's part of Islamic culture, and Islamic culture has, especially African Islamic culture, that's practiced widely within the culture, and particularly in parts, and in other parts of the Indian subcontinent, and the idea of sort of slavery and of taxing the unbeliever, and all these things are part of Islamic culture, which are completely, totally anti-Western. And so I will pause there just for a moment to get a drink, which I was going to do about 25 minutes ago. But we have to understand, I think, that we have something worth saving, and that's what I think. And when we have radical communists and radical Islamists and jihadists who are joining together to cause as much disruption and destruction and chaos, and their aim is to make it ungovernable. It's like I think the head of the American Communist Party, he actually said that the aim of, the basic aim is to make it city or a locality ungovernable. And that's what they're trying to do in Minnesota, because within there it's pulled the lid off all the enormous corruption, all the enormous amounts of money laundering that's been going on. And so this is just a convenient vehicle, in a sense, this so-called ICE action. Because ICE, flooded other big American cities and has done this, and they haven't had the same reaction. But the problem is here is you've got this additional element where you've basically got this enormous block, this block of people of either a Somali ascent or Somali refugees. So I think it's something like 600,000 or something, isn't it, or something, which is this enormous voting block. And if somebody can hold that voting block, then they can ensure their political power, and that's what's been going on, and it's allegedly going on, if I want to be legally correct. But this seems to be as what's happened, is that this enormous amount of corruption has built itself around, because this is inbuilt within the culture. And for us, as in order to address this and to deal with this, we need to deal with our suicidal empathy, which is basically because we basically come from, say, we have Christian values, even though people don't realise they're Christian values, of compassion, of protecting the poor, of sheltering the stranger. I really need to do a big study on this. Is one of the most quoted things that people, where they say, look, here the Bible says that we're supposed to shelter the stranger, and that's only one part of it. That is only one tiny little aspect of that whole passage. If you study those passages in Leviticus and Exodus, where they talk about, and Deuteronomy, where they talk about foreigners, and because it does say there's only one rule for the foreigner, and that rule has to be the same as for the native born. But that doesn't mean that means that the foreigner can then establish their own cultural subculture within your culture. They're coming in the biblical concept in many ways is very much mirrored in that sort of American concept of the melting pot, where people decide to become Americans. So when in sort of like the biblical accounts of this and the biblical accounts of migration, people weren't going to be permitted to come into, say, the Israeli nation there and then establish their own little autonomous subculture within that culture. They were supposed to be becoming Israelis. They were embracing they were embracing, if you like, the values of the nation they came to. They weren't made to. This is an interesting one from the point of view of religious freedom, is that they didn't have to convert or become, to the Jewish religion, but what they couldn't do is sort of like build their own temples and have public displays of their own religiosity, their own religious tradition. Like, say, for example, in the UK now, I've been to sort of like some of the cities where I sort of like on the outside, I thought, what's that building? What's that up there? And it's this is enormous mosque. It's built on a hillside. In sort of like Oxfordshire. In one of these, so it's like that sort of expression of, say, is something that's outside the biblical concept of immigration or becoming or migrating to another country. You would not be able to, in that public fashion, to, if you like, say, establish some sort of what would be called in their culture idolatrous, and because it's raising up another god, and it's contravening your cultural values as your society. So even though lots of people sort of like focus on one of the scriptures in that passage, and it's all in most passages, but there's lots of passages where it talks about foreigners having in Israel having exactly the same rights as the native born, but they also have the same responsibilities as the native born. They still have a loyalty to the culture, and that's something that the American founders, I think, recognized very well. Okay, so that's 1 hour, so I'm definitely going to stop now and come back. But I do want to just make some sort of other, I hope, shorter observations about Islam to try and show the difference, to show how different the value set is. Okay, see you shortly.